Okay, so the desktop is all glued up now. I let it sit for, I think, about 15 hours, something like that, and it's all nice and solid and we're ready to start working on it. So what I've gone through and done now is I went through and roughly cleaned up the glue squeeze out so we have a nice flat surface to work with, and then I've now squared up both of the ends, so we're now at our final 63-inch length for this internal panel. Now we need to move on to actually making the breadboard ends. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that you're making and attaching the breadboard ends before you do any sanding on the top of this. Because as soon as you start sanding, you're going to start creating little dips and valleys in this thing. And especially on the edges where you might sand a little bit too heavy or not enough, you're definitely going to have some areas where it's not perfect. And so the way this panel is right now is it's the flattest it's going to be in the whole lifetime of this thing. As soon as we start sanding, we're going to start creating those little dips and grooves in it. And it's, but at that point it won't matter as much, but when we're trying to do joinery like these breadboard ends, it's really important to have a nice flat panel. And so I'll just talk you guys through the process for actually squaring this up really quickly. The best tool for this would be a track saw, or you could, if you have a large radial arm saw, something like that, where you can hold the panel securely and then cut it would be ideal. Or if you have, I think SawStop makes a large panel sliding crosscut sled thing attachment for their table saws. If you have something like that, that's going to be the ideal way. I don't have any of that. I don't have the money for any of that really expensive equipment. All I have is a simple circular saw and a straight piece of MDF, which you guys saw me use there. And so this, if you take your time and you're patient, you can mimic doing the exact same thing as you would with a track saw. You just need a straight line to follow with your circular saw, and that will cut anything perfectly square, or perfectly straight, I should say. And so the best way to figure out where to put your guide is by figuring out the distance between your blade and the edge of the guide. So on this DeWalt saw here, from the inside of the blade teeth, so from the blade tooth to the edge of the guide here is exactly 5 inches. Now this is one of the big reasons why I like expensive brands like DeWalt here. Even though this isn't an expensive circular saw, I think it's about 90 bucks. It is built to the precision and the high standard that DeWalt makes their tools to. My other circular saw, which you guys might have seen in some of my past videos, the rigid one, is like, I don't know, it's such a weird measurement in from the teeth. It just doesn't work out nicely, whereas this exactly 5 inches in is perfect. It's beautiful, it's easy to work with, easy to measure off of, and it's handily marked right on the front of the thing here. So then once I knew the distance in from the blade that I needed to go, I just decided to go in 1/4 inch. So then measuring in 5 1/4 inches from one of my random pieces, I could mark a line, and that's where I put my piece of MDF. That was going to be my registering mark. Then using a simple combo square, I could hold that up against my edge, which I know is true, or I want to be true anyway. And then I could align the piece of MDF against this, and this gave me enough of a reference point to make sure that that MDF was straight across. And so then to cut the opposite side, I went through and measured down 58 inches because that's where our guide is going to have to go. Because again, we're going for 63 inches total in length, so 63 minus the 5 inches of the circular saw base is going to give us the proper dimension or the proper positioning of our blade to cut that last bit off. And so we made this panel pretty much perfect. I only had a small little bit of offcut on both sides. I think about just under 1/4 inch on both sides. And so we had an absolutely perfect panel to go off of here, and I'm really excited to keep going with it because it's just going to keep being easier and easier and easier. All right, so I've got the breadboard ends all set up. We've got a good fit on them. They're nice and tight. There's no movement to them. They're pretty much as good as I can get them. And so I didn't stop and explain what I was doing when making the breadboard ends because I don't think I'm qualified yet to teach how to do breadboard ends. A lot of the other stuff within woodworking, I'm more than happy to explain what I'm doing, show you guys, and teach you guys how to do it. But with breadboard ends, they are a very complex thing, and I'm just not quite there yet. Even though I can get a pretty good result out of them. I don't want to explain to people because I don't quite know how to explain it properly. It's more of a thing where you just kind of have to mess around with them until you get that perfect fit. So to give you guys just a kind of quick explanation on how I do it, I start by defining an area with the router. Now in past videos, you guys have seen me clear out the whole tenon here with the router, and that is a little bit of a sketchy process because as you take away, the more material you take away with the router, it starts to tip and move around, and that can just get a little bit dangerous. So I think it was the Third Coast Craftsman on his video about making breadboard ends, he starts by just marking a line with either a router or a circular saw or a track saw, whatever method you have, to mark your shoulders that can give you a good accurate line. So I used my router to clear out that line with a 1/2 inch bit in there. That gave me a good amount of reference space. Then I went back in with a chisel and knocked out all that extra material. Then cleaned up that rough area with my low angle jack, which all worked out really well. That's probably gonna be my favorite way to do this now because it's just so much better than working with the router. The router just spits chips everywhere and makes a mess. Whereas getting the hand tools out and getting a little bit of work with them is a lot more enjoyable than working with the router. So one thing I will mention about the router is I made sure not to actually put the depth all the way to fit into my tenons here. It was still oversized so that I couldn't actually get the groove that we have in our end pieces over that tenon that we just cut, which is really important. I learned that one again on one of my past projects when I ended up making the breadboard ends too loose. You don't want to try and hit it with the router. You always want to use hand tools, your hand planes, wherever possible to sneak up on that fit. So then once I had the whole long tenon defined, I could go through and actually cut out my individual tenons, and so I just had to mark them out, matching where I measured on for my mortises, and so then I could cut out the tenons using a combination of different saws just to make sure I can define the area, clean them up with the chisel as best I can. Then I moved on to cleaning the area up with the hand plane. So for pretty much all the work, I used my block plane here, which is a rabbiting block plane, which just means that the blade sticks out to one side or sticks right up against the edge on one side. And this lets me get all the way up against the shoulder and cleanly clear out the whole area here to a nice even depth. So from there, it's a pretty self-explanatory process. All you're doing is just constantly taking away little bits of material, make sure you're working from both sides until your breadboard end fits. That's the basic process of a breadboard end. Again, I'm not going to try and teach you guys how to do this. Someday I will because it's something I really like breadboard ends and I just overall like the look of them and I think they're very functionally good too. And so now we're moving on to actually placing our dowels in here. So one of the important things with the breadboard end is you need to put dowels into each tenon to make sure that you're actually holding them in place. Because when you're making a breadboard end, the important thing is that you only glue the center tenon so that all the other tenons have room to move and expand as this panel moves and expands throughout the seasons. But if you don't put a dowel in there, then this whole thing is just going to rock back and forth, and there's nothing actually holding these other pieces into that breadboard end. So by putting dowels in there and then lightly gluing the dowel on the top side only, you're then creating that pull that's holding the whole thing together. And so for the dowels, when you're trying to figure out the placement for them, one of the important things is not to measure from either of your ends. Because very likely when you're making the breadboard ends, you want to make your mortises wider and your tenons to be the size that you want. And so there's a good chance that your piece is not perfectly centered on the whole table here. But it fits exactly where I want it to right now. And so when I'm marking these holes, what I want to do is mark a line centered on each of my pieces of wood that make up the top here. And then using a square, I can bring that line all the way across onto the breadboard end, and that will give me an accurate location that's centered on my board here, but also lines up perfectly on my breadboard end. Then I just have to drill my hole into the breadboard end and then pass it through into the actual tenon that's on the tabletop here. And so the next important thing is choosing the proper style for your dowels. Now, as you guys have seen in the rest of this project, sometimes I like to add a lot of contrast with my dowels. As you guys saw when we were building the cases, on the main panels, on the side panels, I used white oak dowels so that they would blend in a little bit and not be too loud. Whereas when I connected those side panels to the main post legs, I used walnut dowels to create that little bit of visual contrast, to give a hint of the joinery, all that kind of good stuff. So on this top, I don't think I want to add contrast with the dowels, because I think adding in the white oak is just going to make it a little bit too noisy and a little bit, it's going to show off too much. Whereas I think adding walnut into the walnut is going to blend. You're still going to be able to see the end grain, so it will still have that little bit of a visual difference to it, but I think it'll blend a little bit better and won't be as noisy, which is always nice on a tabletop. The next important decision is the size. So in my shop, I can make 3/8 inch, 1/4 inch, and 3/16 inch dowels. Those are the ones that I have the tools to make. very easily. I could always go and get more, but I just don't feel like doing that for this project. So if I was gonna go with white oak dowels, I would probably go with the 1/4 inch size. You can see this is a piece of 1/4 inch dowel just from Home Depot, and that's a much better size compared to the 3/8 dowel. The 3/8 dowel on here feels a little bit too large. Even though it's a very large tabletop, the 3/8 dowel just seems too big for this 3-inch wide piece. Whereas the 1/4 inch visually fits much better. It takes up less of a visual area. But because I'm going to be sticking with walnut for this project, I'm going to use the largest dowel size I can make, which is the 3/8. Because the larger the dowel you can have, the more rigidity it has to it, the stronger it's going to be in the long run.